Oh, hello. When I was a girl, a friend of my father's gave me a book he'd just written and asked me what I thought of it. It was called James and the Normal-Sized Peach. I said, could you make it bigger? He made it a giant peach, and the rest is history. Now, I happen to know that this story, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, didn't start out the way we've come to know it either. They tried many versions before they got it right. First, they tried Snow White and the 7-Up, but she just had a nice refreshing soda and the story was over. Then they tried Snow White and the 7 o'clock news, Snow White and the 7 angry poodles, Snow White and the 7 drunken frat boys, Snow Yellow and the 7 drunken frat boys, Snow White and Scooby-Doo in the mystery at Ghost Island, Snow White and the 7 bottles of beer on the wall, then just 7 bottles of beer on the wall, Snow White and the Sorcerer's Stone, Snow White and the skinny guy who works at the 7-Eleven, Snow White dancing and tripping gaily down the yellow brick road, finally Snow White and Garfunkel. So you see, they worked very hard to get it just right. And the lesson is, if you keep trying and you don't give up, you might just create something wonderful. Like this, Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, in the middle of winter, when the flakes of snow were falling like feathers from the sky, a queen sat at a window sewing, and the frame of the window was made of black ebony. And whilst she was sewing and looking out of the window at the snow, she pricked her finger with a needle, and 3 drops of blood fell upon the snow, and the red looked pretty upon the white snow, and she thought to herself, would that I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of the window frame. And soon after that she had a little daughter, who was as white as snow, and as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony, and she was therefore called Snow White. And when the child was born, the queen died. After a year had passed, the king took to himself another wife. She was a beautiful woman, but proud and haughty, and she could not bear that anyone else could surpass her in beauty. She had a wonderful looking glass, and when she stood in front of it and looked at herself in it and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all? The looking glass answered, thou, O queen, are the fairest of all. Well, then she was satisfied, for she knew that the looking glass spoke the truth. But Snow White was growing up, and grew more and more beautiful. And when she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as the day and more beautiful than the queen herself. And once, when the queen asked her looking glass on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all? It answered, thou art fairer than all who are here, lady queen, but more beautiful still is Snow White, as I ween. Well, then the queen was shocked, and turned yellow and green with envy. And from that hour, whenever she looked at Snow White, her heart heaved in her breast. She hated the girl so much, and envy and pride grew higher and higher in her heart like a weed, so that she had no peace day or night. She called a huntsman and said, take the child away into the forest. I will no longer have her in my sight. Kill her, and bring me back her lung and liver as a token. The huntsman obeyed and took her away, but when he had drawn his knife and was about to pierce Snow White's innocent heart, she began to weep and said, oh, dear huntsman, leave me my life. I will run away into the wild forest and never come home again. And as she was so beautiful, the huntsman had pity on her and said, run away then, you poor child. The wild beasts will soon have devoured you, thought he, and yet he seemed very happy, as if a stone had been rolled from his heart, since he was no longer needful for him to kill her. And as a young bear just came running by, he stabbed it and cut out its lung and liver and took them to the queen as proof that the child was dead. The cook had to salt them, and the wicked queen ate them and thought that she had eaten the lung and liver of Snow White. But now the poor child was all alone in the great forest, and so terrified that she looked at all the leaves on the trees and did not know what to do. And then she began to run, and ran away over sharp stones and through thorns, and the wild beasts ran past her, but did her no harm. She ran as long as her feet would go until it was almost evening, and then she saw a little cottage and went into it to rest herself. Everything in the cottage was small, but neater and cleaner than can be told. There was a table on which there was a white cover, and 7 little plates, and on each plate a little spoon. Moreover, there were 7 little knives and forks, and 7 little mugs. Against the wall stood 7 little beds side by side, and covered up with snow-white counterpanes. Snow White was so hungry and thirsty that she ate some vegetables and bread from each plate, and drank a drop of wine out of each mug, for she did not wish to take all from one only. Then, as she was so tired, she laid herself down on one of the little beds, but none of them suited her. One was too long, another too short, but at last she found that the 7th one was right, and so she remained in it, said a prayer, and went to sleep. When it was quite dark, the owners of the cottage came back. They were 7 dwarfs, who dug and delved into the mountains for ore. They lit their 7 candles, and as it was now light within the cottage, they saw that someone had been there, for everything was not in the same order in which they had left it. The first one said, "Who's been sitting in my chair?" And the second, "Who's been eating off my plate?" And the third, "Who's been taking some of my bread?" And the fourth, "Who's been eating my vegetables?" And the fifth, "Who's been using my fork?" And the sixth, "Who's been cutting with my knife?" And the seventh, "Who's been drinking out of my mug?" Then the first looked around and saw that there was a little hollow on his bed, and he said, "Who's been sleeping in my bed?" And the others came up and each called out, "Someone's been lying in my bed too." But the 7th, when he looked at his bed, saw little Snow White, who was lying asleep therein. And he called the others, who came running up, and they cried out with astonishment, and brought their 7 little candles, and let the light fall on Snow White. "Oh, heavens, cried they. "What a lovely child." And they were so glad that they did not wake her up, but let her sleep on the bed. And the 7th dwarf slept with his companions, 1 hour with each, and so passed the night. When it was morning, Snow White awoke, and was frightened when she saw the 7 dwarfs. But they were friendly, and asked her what her name was. "My name is Snow White," she answered. "Well, how have you come to our house?" said the dwarfs. And then she told them that her stepmother had wished to have her killed, but that the huntsman had spared her life, and that she had run for the whole day until at last she had found their dwelling. The dwarf said, "If you will take care of our house, cook, make the beds, wash, sew and knit, and if you will keep everything neat and clean, well, you can stay with us, and you shall want for nothing." "Yes," said Snow White, "with all my heart," and she stayed with them. She kept the house in order for them. In the mornings they went to the mountains and looked for copper and gold, and in the evenings they came back, and they had to have their supper ready. The girl was alone the whole day, so the good dwarfs warned her and said, "Beware of your stepmother. She will soon know that you are here. Be sure to let no one come in." But the queen, believing that she had eaten Snow White's lung and liver, could not but think that she was again the first and most beautiful of all. And she went to her looking-glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the glass answered, "O Queen, thou art fairest for all to see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." Then she was astounded, for she knew that the looking-glass never spoke falsely, and she knew that the huntsman had betrayed her, and that Snow White was still alive. And so she thought and thought again about how she might kill her, for so long as she was not the fairest in the whole land, envy let her have no rest. And when she had at last thought of something to do, she painted her face and dressed herself like an old peddler woman, and no one could have known her. In this disguise, she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs, and knocked at the door and cried, "Pretty things to sell, very cheap, very cheap." Little Snow White looked out of the window and called out, "Oh, good day, my good woman. What have you to sell?" "Oh, good things, pretty things," she answered, "stay laces of all colors," and she pulled out one which was woven of bright-colored silk. "I may let the worthy old woman in," thought Snow White, and she unbolted the door and bought the pretty laces. "Child," said the old woman, "what a fright you look. Come, I will lace you properly for once." Snow White had no suspicion, but stood before her and let herself be laced with the new laces. But the old woman laced so quickly and so tightly that Snow White lost her breath and fell down as if dead. "You were the most beautiful," said the queen to herself, and ran away. Not long afterwards, in the evening, the 7 dwarfs came home, but how shocked they were when they saw dear little Snow White lying on the ground, and that she neither stirred nor moved and seemed to be dead. They lifted her up, and they saw that she was laced too tightly. They cut the laces, and then she began to breathe a little, and after a while came to life again. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was no one else than the wicked queen. Take care and let no one come in when we are not with you." But the wicked woman, when she had reached home, went in front of the glass and asked, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And it answered as before, "O Queen, thou art fairest for all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When she heard that, all her blood rushed to her heart with fear, for she saw plainly that Snow White was again alive. "Now," she said, "I will think of something that shall really put an end to you." And by the help of witchcraft, which she understood, she made a poisonous comb. Then she disguised herself and took the shape of another old woman. So she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs, knocked at the door, and cried, "Good things to sell, cheap, cheap." Little Snow White looked out and said, "Go away, I cannot let anyone in." "Well, I suppose you can look," said the old woman, and pulled out the poisonous comb and held it up. It pleased the girl so well that she let herself be beguiled and opened the door. And when they had made a bargain, the old woman said, "Now I will comb you properly for once." Poor little Snow White had no suspicion, and let the old woman do as she pleased. But hardly had she put the comb in her hair than the poison in it took effect, and the girl fell down senseless. "You paragon of beauty," said the wicked woman, "you are done for now." And she went away. But fortunately, it was almost evening when the 7 dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying as if dead upon the ground, they at once suspected the stepmother, and they looked and found the poisoned comb. Scarcely had they taken it out when Snow White came to herself and told them what had happened. And then they warned her once more to be upon her guard and to open the door to no one. The queen, at home, went in front of the glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" Then it answered as before, "O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When she heard the glass speak thus, she trembled and shook with rage. "Snow White shall die," she cried, "even if it costs me my life." Thereupon, she went into a quite secret, lonely room where no one ever came, and there she made a very poisonous apple. Outside, it looked pretty, white with a red cheek, so that everyone who saw it longed for it, but whoever ate a piece of it must surely die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and dressed herself up as a farmer's wife, and so she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs. She knocked at the door. Snow White put her head out of the window and said, "I cannot let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs have forbidden me." "But it is all the same to me," answered the woman. "I shall soon get rid of my apples. There, I will give you one." "No," said Snow White, "I dare not take anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" said the old woman. "Look, I will cut the apple in 2 pieces. You eat the red cheek, and I'll eat the white." The apple was so cunningly made that only the red cheek was poisoned. Snow White longed for the fine apple, and when she saw that the woman ate part of it, well, she could resist no longer, and stretched out her hand and took the poisonous half. But hardly had she a bit of it in her mouth, and she fell down dead. Then the queen looked at her with a dreadful look, and laughed aloud, and said, "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony wood, this time the dwarfs cannot wake you up again." And when she asked of the looking glass at home, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And it answered at last, O Queen, in this land thou art fairest of all. Then her envious heart had a rest, so far as an envious heart can have rest. And the dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, found Snow White lying upon the ground. She breathed no longer and was dead. They lifted her up, looked to see whether they could find anything poisonous, unlaced her, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but it was still of no use. The poor child was dead and remained dead. They laid her upon a bier, and all 7 of them sat round it and wept for her, and wept 3 long days. Then they were going to bury her, but she still looked as if she were living, and still had the pretty red cheeks. They said, we could not bury her in the dark ground, and they had a transparent coffin of glass made, so that she could be seen from all sides, and they laid her in it, and wrote her name upon it in golden letters, and said that she was a king's daughter. Then they put the coffin out upon the mountain, and one of them always stayed by it and watched it. And birds came too, and wept for Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and last a dove. And now Snow White lay a long, long time in the coffin, and she did not change, but looked as if she were asleep, for she was as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that a king's son came into the forest and went to the dwarf's house to spend the night. He saw the coffin on the mountain and the beautiful Snow White within it, and read what was written upon it in golden letters. Then he said to the dwarfs, let me have the coffin, I will give you whatever you want for it. But the dwarfs answered, we will not part for it with all the gold in the world. Then he said, let me have it as a gift, for I cannot live without seeing Snow White. I will honor and prize her as my dearest possession. As he spoke in this way, the good dwarfs took pity upon him and gave him the coffin. And now the king's son had it carried away by his servants on their shoulders. And it happened that they stumbled over a tree stump, and with the shock, the poisonous piece of apple which Snow White had bitten off came out of her throat, and before long she opened her eyes, lifted up the lid of the coffin, sat up, and was once more alive. Oh, heavens, where am I? She cried. The king's son, full of joy, said, you are with me. And he told her what had happened and said, I love you more than everything in the world. Come with me to my father's palace. You shall be my wife. And Snow White was willing, and went with him, and their wedding was held with great show and splendor. But Snow White's wicked stepmother was also bidden to the feast. When she had arrayed herself in beautiful clothes, she went before the looking-glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is fairest of all? The glass answered, O Queen, of all here the fairest art thou, but the young queen is fairer by far, as I trow. Then the wicked woman uttered a curse, and was so wretched, so utterly wretched, that she knew not what to do. At first, she would not go to the wedding at all, but she had no peace, and had to go to see the young queen. And when she went in, she recognized Snow White, and she stood still with rage and fear, and could not stir. But iron slippers had already been put upon the fire, and they were brought in with tongs and set before her. And then the wicked queen was forced to put on the red-hot shoes and dance until she dropped down dead. The end. Oh, hello. Did I ever tell you what I did after college? I decided to drive a dog sled across Alaska. It was thrilling. Just me, 3 dogs, a bundle of food and books. At night, I'd lie by the fire and read, and sometimes the sky would turn completely green from the northern lights. Soon the weather began to grow very cold, and I had to begin to burn my books to stay warm. One day, as it began to get dark, I stopped at an igloo. The Eskimo family that lived there very kindly offered me to stay the night, and I very gladly accepted. Now, I'd forgotten that winter nights in Alaska are 6 months long. Of course, I didn't want to offend them, so I stayed the whole time, 175 days. Oh, the Eskimo family, they were so sweet. Every day the little girl would give me a present that she'd made me from the day before. And eventually they even gave me a new name, Anyukeyu, which I later found out translated to stranger who will not leave no matter how many farewell gifts we give her. You live and learn. Oh, and the only book that I had to read all that long night were the Tales of Mark Twain. And this story was one of my favorites from it. The story of the bad little boy. Once there was a bad little boy whose name was Jim. Though, if you will notice, you'll find that bad little boys are nearly always called James in your Sunday school books. It was strange, but still it was true that this one was called Jim. He didn't have any sick mother either. A sick mother who was pious and had the consumption and would be glad to lie down in the grave and be at rest, but for the strong love she bore her boy and the anxiety she felt that the world might be harsh and cold towards him when she was gone. Most bad boys in the Sunday school books are named James and have sick mothers who teach them to say, "Now I lay me down," etc., and sing them to sleep with sweet, plaintive voices, and then kiss them good night and kneel down by the bedside and weep. But it was different with this fellow. He was named Jim, and there wasn't anything the matter with his mother. No consumption, nor anything of that kind. She was rather stout than otherwise, and she was not pious. Moreover, she was not anxious on Jim's account. She said if he were to break his neck, it wouldn't be much loss. She always spanked Jim to sleep, and she never kissed him good night. On the contrary, she boxed his ears when she was ready to leave him. Once, this little boy stole the key of the pantry and slipped in there and helped himself to some jam and filled up the vessel with tar so that his mother would never know the difference. But all at once, a terrible feeling didn't come over him, and something didn't seem to whisper to him, "Is it right to disobey my mother? Isn't it sinful to do this? Where do bad little boys go who gobble up their good, kind mother's jam?" And then he didn't kneel down all alone and promise never to be wicked any more, and rise up with a light, happy heart and go and tell his mother all about it and beg her forgiveness and be blessed by her with tears of pride and thankfulness in her eyes. No. That's the way with all the other bad boys in the books, but it happened otherwise with this Jim, strangely enough. He ate that jam and he said it was bully, in his sinful, vulgar way, and he put in the tar and said that was bully also, and laughed, and observed that the old woman would get up and snort when she found it out, and when she did find it out, he denied knowing anything about it, and she whipped him severely, and he did the crying himself, and everything about this boy was curious. Everything turned out differently with him from the way it does to the bad Jameses in the book. Once he climbed up in Farmer Acorn's apple tree to steal apples, and the limb didn't break. And he didn't fall and break his arm and get torn by the farmer's great dog and then languish on a sick bed for weeks and repent and become good. Oh, no. He stole as many apples as he wanted, came down all right, and he was all ready for the dog too, and knocked him endwise with a brick when he came to tear him. It was very strange. Well, nothing like it ever happened in those mild little books with marbled backs and with pictures in them of men with swallow-tailed coats and bell-crowned hats and pantaloons that are short in the legs and women with the waists of their dresses under their arms and no hoops on. Nothing like it in any of the Sunday school books. Once, he stole the teacher's penknife, and when he was afraid he would be found out and would get whipped, he slipped it into George Wilson's cap. Poor widow Wilson's son, the moral boy. The good little boy of the village, who always obeyed his mother, never told an untruth, and was fond of his lessons, and infatuated with Sunday school. And when the knife dropped from the cap, and poor George hung his head and blushed, as if in conscious guilt, and the grieved teacher charged the theft upon him, and was just in the very act of bringing the switch down upon his trembling shoulders, a white-haired, improbable justice of the peace did not suddenly appear in their midst and strike an attitude and say, "Spare this noble boy, there stands the cowering culprit. I was passing the school door at recess, and unseen myself, I saw the theft committed." And then Jim didn't get whaled, and the venerable justice didn't read the tearful school a homily and take George by the hand and say such a boy deserved to be exalted, and then tell him to come and make his home with him, and sweep out his office, and make fires, and run errands, and chop wood, and study law, and help his wife to do household labors, and have all the balance of the time to play and get 40 cents a month and be happy. No. It would have happened that way in the books, but it didn't happen that way to Jim. No meddling old clam of a justice dropped in to make trouble, and so the model boy George got thrashed. And Jim was glad of it, because, Jim hated moral boys. Jim said he was down on them milksops. Such was the coarse language of this bad, neglected boy. But the strangest thing that ever happened to Jim was the time he went boating on Sunday and didn't get drowned. And that other time they got caught out in the storm when he was fishing on Sunday, and he didn't get struck by lightning. Why, you might look and look and look all through the Sunday school books from now till Christmas, and you would never come across anything like that. Oh no, you'd find that all the bad boys who go boating on Sunday invariably get drowned. And all the bad boys who get caught out in storms when they're fishing on Sunday infallibly get struck by lightning. Boats with bad boys in them always upset on Sunday. And it always storms when bad boys go fishing on the Sabbath. How this Jim ever escaped is a mystery to me. This Jim bore a charmed life. That must have been the way of it. Nothing could hurt him. He even gave the elephant in the menagerie a plug of tobacco, and the elephant didn't knock the top of his head off with his trunk. He browsed around the cupboard after essence of peppermint and didn't make a mistake and drink poison. He stole his father's gun and went hunting on the Sabbath and didn't shoot off 3 or 4 of his fingers. He struck his little sister on the temple with his fist when he was angry, and she didn't linger in pain through long summer days and die with the sweet words of forgiveness upon her lips that redoubled the anguish of his breaking heart. No, she got over it. He ran off and went at last to sea, and didn't come back and find himself sad and alone in the world, his loved ones sleeping in the quiet churchyard, and the vine-embowered home of his boyhood tumbled down and gone to decay. Oh, no, he came home as drunk as a piper and got into the station house the very first thing. And he grew up, and he married, and he raised a large family, and brained them all with an axe one night, and got wealthy by all manner of cheating and rascality, and now he's the infernalest, wickedest scoundrel in his native village, and is universally respected and belongs to the legislature. So you see, there never was a bad James in the Sunday school books that had such a streak of luck as the sinful Jim with the charmed life. The end.